The early 20th century belonged to Western empires. Britain controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface. France, the Netherlands, and the United States carved up Asia like a banquet table. Across the Pacific, the rule was simple: the white powers led, and everyone else followed. But one nation, an island chain with no oil, no iron, and no colonial history, refused to accept that arrangement. Japan had modernized faster than any civilization in recorded history. It had beaten Russia. It had beaten China. It had allied with Britain during the First World War and emerged on the winning side. And yet, by 1941, the West had cornered it into a choice between humiliation and war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan chose war, and ignited the most consequential naval attack in modern history. At 7:48 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, the skies above Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, turned dark with aircraft. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo had launched the first wave from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Oahu, 183 planes screaming toward the most powerful American naval base in the Pacific. At 7:53 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fukuda transmitted the signal that would echo through history: Tora! 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 The code word confirming complete surprise. The Americans never saw it coming. Within 2 hours, Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft had decimated Battleship Row. 19 American ships were sunk or damaged. 347 aircraft were destroyed or disabled. 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 wounded. The USS Arizona alone swallowed 1,177 men when a single bomb detonated her forward ammunition magazine, producing an explosion so catastrophic the shockwaves shook buildings miles away. But this raises a critical question. Why did Japan, a nation that had spent decades building a partnership with Western powers, launch a surprise attack on the United States? What chain of events made this outcome not just possible, but, from Tokyo's perspective, inevitable? What had America done to push Japan to this precise, catastrophic moment? To understand December 7, 1941, go back to July 8, 1853. Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy sailed 4 warships, the Black Ships, into Edo Bay and demanded that Japan open its ports to American trade. Japan, isolated under its Tokugawa shogunate for over 200 years, had no warships capable of resisting. Perry delivered a letter from President Millard Fillmore, aimed his guns toward the shore, and promised to return for an answer the following year. Japan had no choice but to comply. The Convention of Kanagawa, signed in March 1854, opened Japan's doors. The Harris Treaty of 1858 blew them off the hinges. Granting American citizens extraterritorial rights on Japanese soil and fixing Japanese import tariffs at rates favorable to the United States. Japan had been legally overmatched without a single shot fired. The lesson Japanese leaders absorbed was not one of peace. It was one of power. A nation without modern weapons was a nation at the mercy of those who had them. This realization helped drive the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Emperor Meiji dismantled the old feudal order, industrialized the country at breakneck speed, and built a military modeled on the most powerful European armies. Japan transformed from a feudal agrarian society into an industrial military power. And then, in a move of breathtaking irony, Japan did to its neighbors what Perry had done to it. In 1876, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed warships into Korean waters and forced the signing of the Japan-Korea Treaty of Amity, a document strikingly similar in its use of coercion to what Perry had extracted from Japan just 2 decades earlier. Japan, once coerced at gunpoint, had become the nation doing the coercing. The appetite for expansion only grew. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 ended with Japan seizing Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, and extracting a massive indemnity from China. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 stunned the world, Japan destroyed the Russian Pacific Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima and forced Russia to concede control over Manchuria and Korea. Western nations watched in equal parts admiration and alarm. By the time World War I ended in 1918, Japan sat at the Paris Peace Conference as one of the Big Five victorious powers. It had contributed little to the actual fighting, but it had earned its seat at the table. Japan submitted a proposal to enshrine racial equality as a principle of the new League of Nations. President Woodrow Wilson blocked it. The British Empire blocked it. The message was unmistakable: Japan was welcome to be a great power, as long as it remained a subordinate one. Japan never forgave this humiliation. The Great Depression of the 1930s shattered Japan's export economy. Raw silk, its single largest export, accounting for roughly 40% of export earnings, collapsed in value as American consumers stopped buying luxuries. As unemployment rose, political radicalism followed. The Imperial Army, not the civilian government, filled the vacuum. In September 1931, the Guangdong Army staged the Mukden Incident, blowing up a small section of Japanese-owned railway in Manchuria and blaming Chinese saboteurs. Using this manufactured pretext, Japan invaded Manchuria within days and installed a puppet state called Manchukuo by 1932. The League of Nations condemned the action. Japan resigned from the League. The civilian government in Tokyo lost all meaningful control over the military. Full-scale war with China erupted in July 1937, triggered by a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. What followed was catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Army captured Nanjing in December 1937 and executed an estimated 200,000 Chinese civilians in 6 weeks. The international outrage was immediate. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stopped short of sanctions, but he began what he called a moral embargo, discouraging American companies from selling aircraft to Japan. This was only the first pressure. The real stranglehold was coming. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, formally aligning itself with the Axis powers. The United States, though not yet in the war, moved decisively. Roosevelt banned the export of aviation fuel and scrap metal to Japan, resources the imperial military consumed in enormous quantities. Japan's generals calculated they had perhaps 18 months of reserves. Then came the final trigger. In July 1941, Japan occupied French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, to secure a staging ground for further operations in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt's response was immediate and total. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed. In a single stroke, Japan lost access to 80% of its oil imports. Japan consumed roughly 12,000 tons of oil every day. Without American, British, and Dutch supplies, that number was unsustainable. The Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, sat directly to the south, rich in oil fields. Japan could seize them, but doing so risked war with Britain and the United States. Diplomacy offered one last exit. Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu met repeatedly with Secretary of State Cordell Hull through late 1941. America demanded a complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina. Japan refused. The negotiations collapsed. Cornered, the empire chose its gamble. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, understood the strategic reality with crystalline clarity. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. America's industrial output was 10 times greater. Its population was twice as large. Its resource base was effectively unlimited. So the only path to Japanese survival, or at least to a negotiated peace, was a catastrophic opening blow that destroyed American naval power in the Pacific before it could be deployed. Yamamoto's plan was simultaneous and audacious. While the Pearl Harbor strike force hit Hawaii, separate Japanese operations would launch against the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies, all within hours of each other. The logic was brutal but coherent. If Japan could shatter America's Pacific Fleet and seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia in one coordinated operation, it could build a defensive perimeter so vast and fortified that America would judge reconquest too costly. Yamamoto himself doubted it would work permanently. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," he reportedly reflected. But with oil reserves draining by the day and no diplomatic solution in sight, the Japanese War Council saw no alternative. On November 26, 1941, the strike force, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 8 tankers, sailed east into the North Pacific under strict radio silence. The die was cast. Sunday morning on Oahu felt like any other weekend. American sailors slept in. Officers played golf. Radar operators at Opana Point detected a massive incoming formation at 7:02 a.m. and reported it to the duty officer, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. Tyler assumed it was a scheduled flight of B-17s arriving from the mainland. He told them not to worry about it. 15 minutes later, 183 Japanese aircraft crossed the northern coastline of Oahu. The first wave targeted the airfields at Wheeler, Hickam, and Ford Island simultaneously, obliterating American aircraft on the ground before they could scramble. Then the torpedo planes hit Battleship Row. Low-altitude horizontal bombers followed. The USS Oklahoma capsized after taking 5 torpedo hits. The USS West Virginia sank at her moorings. The USS California settled to the bottom of the harbor. The USS Nevada, remarkably, got her engines running and made for the harbor entrance, becoming the only battleship to get underway during the attack. Japanese pilots redirected their bombs toward her, and she beached herself to avoid blocking the channel. Then came the moment that eclipsed everything else. At 8:10 a.m. a Japanese armor-piercing bomb penetrated the forward deck of the USS Arizona and detonated her front powder magazine. The explosion vaporized the forward section of the ship in seconds. The fireball rose hundreds of feet. 1,177 men died in that single instant. The Arizona still lies at the bottom of Pearl Harbor today, still leaking oil, still bleeding, some say. The second wave arrived at 8:54 a.m. with 170 more aircraft. By 9:55 a.m., it was over. Final toll. 19 ships sunk or damaged, 347 aircraft destroyed or disabled, 2,403 killed, 1,178 wounded. Japan lost just 29 aircraft and 64 men. But Japan's planners had miscalculated something monumental. The 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to Pearl Harbor, the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were not in port that morning. They were at sea. They survived. And aircraft carriers, not battleships, would decide the Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not cripple the United States. It unified it. On December 8, 1941, less than 24 hours after the last Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and called December 7, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan with a single dissenting vote. On December 11, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States, honoring the Tripartite Pact. Roosevelt had sought a reason to enter the European war for over 2 years. Japan had delivered it. Britain declared war on Japan on December 8. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the Netherlands followed within hours. The Pacific War, which Japan had hoped to contain to a swift regional victory, instantly became a theater of the largest global conflict in human history. The consequences for Japan were exactly what Yamamoto had feared. The sleeping giant awoke. American industrial production shifted entirely to war output. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 18 fleet carriers, 110 escort carriers, 349 destroyers, and over 80,000 aircraft per year by 1944. Japan could not match it. Island by island, the American advance rolled westward. Midway in June 1942 destroyed Japan's carrier fleet and broke its offensive power permanently. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. By August 1945, atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. The nation that Commodore Matthew Perry had coerced open with 4 gunships in 1853 had, in the span of less than a century, built an empire, challenged the world's greatest powers, and been reduced to rubble. Japan had learned from Perry that power was the only language the world respected. What it failed to learn was the one lesson that mattered most, that power, without wisdom, is only the long way to ruin.